Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really chilling historical true crime story. We're talking about a narrative packed with political intrigue, sudden violence, and a massive cover-up that quite literally changed the course of the 20th century. We are going to look closely at the life, the courageous defiance, and the tragic assassination of the Italian socialist leader Giacomo Matteotti. Okay, let's dive right into this. We kind of have this tendency to think that dictatorships just take over overnight, right? Like maybe through some massive, sudden military coup. But history actually shows us it's usually a process, a slow burn. So our central mystery today is figuring out how a single political assassination, a brutal crime committed in broad daylight, mind you, became the ultimate catalyst that allowed Benito Mussolini to completely dismantle Italy's fragile democratic institutions and set up a totalitarian regime. So, starting with part 1, the highly rigged 1924 election and just how fragile Italian democracy really was at the time. To really understand this murder, we have to travel back to the early days of 1924. Mussolini had already been prime minister since late 1922, but he needed a legal mechanism to seize absolute control. He couldn't just take it, he had to make it look legitimate. Enter the Acerbo Law, passed in 1923. It basically stated that whichever party received the largest share of the votes, as long as it just crossed a 25% threshold, would automatically be granted 2/3 of the seats in parliament. It was essentially a legal math trick designed specifically for total legislative dominance without actually needing a true majority of popular support. And, well, it worked. In the April 1924 elections, the Fascist Party secured a massive 64.9% of the vote. But here's the thing. This staggering statistic wasn't just the result of that Acerbo law trick. It was achieved through rampant voter intimidation, widespread fraud, and outright violence at the ballot boxes. The election was a total sham. Everyone knew it, but very, very few people actually had the courage to say it out loud. That brings us to Section 2, Matteotti's final stand and his incredible defiance in Parliament. Enter Giacomo Matteotti. He was the leader of the Unitary Socialist Party, a genuinely brilliant legal mind and a fierce, uncompromising critic of Mussolini. On May 30, 1924, Matteotti stood up and delivered this blistering speech denouncing the election results, all while being met with shouted death threats from the fascist deputies literally surrounding him in the room. He concluded with this incredibly prophetic quote, "Myself, I have made my speech. Now you are preparing the funeral speech for me." He knew, without a doubt, that putting these facts on the official record was effectively signing his own death warrant. Moving to Section 3, the Juneteenth abduction, a crime committed in broad daylight. Let's break down the exact events that unfolded just 11 days after that speech, really putting our true crime lenses on here. At around 4:15 p.m. on June 10, Matteotti left his home for a walk toward the Parliament building. As he walked along the busy Lungo Tevere Arnaldo de Braccia, which is a main road running right alongside the Tiber River in Rome, he was ambushed. Waiting for him was a blue Lancia Kappa, license plate 2535, a vehicle that had actually been provided by a fascist operative named Filippo Filippelli. Now, what's really important to grasp here is that these weren't just random rogue attackers. This was a highly organized hit squad belonging to the Secca, a secret political police force set up directly within the Fascist Party, answering straight to Mussolini's inner circle. Led by the notorious Americo Dumini, the squad included Albino Volpi, Giuseppe Viola, Augusto Malacria, and Amleto Poveramono. Naming them is important because it grounds the crime entirely in the accountable actions of the regime's own operatives. This was state-sponsored. But Matteotti did not go quietly. He fought back furiously against his 5 attackers. They dragged him into the back of the Lancia, where this brutal, desperate struggle ensued. In a last-ditch attempt to leave a clue as to what was happening, Matteotti actually managed to throw his parliamentary ID card out the car window near the Ponte del Risorgimento, where local farmers later found it. Unable to restrain him, one of the attackers finally drew a knife and fatally stabbed him in the chest and under the arm. 25 kilometers? To put that in perspective, that is how far the assassins drove out of Rome in a frantic, messy cover-up operation. They headed deep into the countryside, finally stopping at a dense forest called the Macchia della Quartarella. Lacking proper tools, they horrifyingly used the car's metal jack to dig a shallow grave, literally folding Matteotti's body in 2 just to make it fit. It's a really stark, gruesome reminder of how quickly and violently political opposition can be silenced when the rule of law begins to crumble. let's look at Section 4, the Aventine Secession Crisis and the resulting Parliament walkout. When Matteotti vanished, the entire country just erupted. Mussolini was plunged into the absolute deepest crisis of his political career. Following that May 30th speech and the June 10th abduction, the tension completely paralyzed the capital for months. On August 16th, Matteotti's decomposing body was finally discovered in that forest, which basically poured gasoline on the fire of public outrage. For the rest of 1924, Mussolini's grip on power hung by a tiny thread. He was isolated, his moderate allies were fleeing left and right, and the government was practically at a standstill. So, the crucial thing to understand here is the strategy of the opposition's walkout, which became known as the Aventine Secession. The opposition deputies basically boycotted Parliament. They hoped that by removing themselves from the government, they would totally delegitimize Mussolini and force King Victor Emmanuel III to officially step in and dismiss him. But this was a fatal miscalculation. The king remained completely passive. Why? Because the conservative elites, the wealthy industrialists, and the monarchy feared a left-wing socialist revival far more than they cared about the murder of one single deputy. They simply preferred the violent status quo of Mussolini over the risk of a socialist revolution. Which brings us to Section 5. Mussolini takes responsibility, the major turning point. By New Year's Eve 1924, Mussolini's own extremist base, the militant black shirts, were getting incredibly tired of his hesitation. They actually marched right into his office and delivered a strict ultimatum. Take control of this crisis and crush the opposition, or we're going to replace you ourselves. So, backed into a corner, on January 3rd, 1925, Mussolini stood before the remaining members of the Chamber of Deputies. And instead of resigning, instead of apologizing, he boldly pivoted and went entirely on the offensive. He delivered these shocking words. He said, "I, and I alone, assume the political, moral, and historical responsibility for all that has happened." Now, it is absolutely vital to understand that this was not a legal confession of guilt for the murder itself. It was a brazen, theatrical dare. He was basically telling the nation that fascism was his creation, and if it had resulted in violence, well, it was a necessary violence. He was daring his paralyzed opponents to try and physically remove him from power. And that leads to Section 6, the birth of dictatorship and the leggi fascistissime, or the most fascist laws. See, Mussolini realized in that moment that his enemies had absolutely no real power to stop him. That January 3rd speech became the immediate gateway to officially ending Italian democracy. Between 1925 and 1926, using what were literally called the most fascist laws, the regime initiated a swift and incredibly systematic crackdown. Step 1, the deputies who had walked out during the Aventine Secession were permanently stripped of their seats. Gone. Step 2, all opposition and anti-fascist newspapers were forcibly shut down. Step 3, all other political parties were entirely banned. A special tribunal was even set up specifically to prosecute enemies of the state. Just like that, the democracy was dismantled. And you might be wondering, what actually happened to the murderers? Well, the corrupt aftermath culminated in a total sham of a trial held in the town of Chieti in 1926. Amerigo Domini and a couple of his accomplices received incredibly brief sentences for what the court absurdly deemed unintentional manslaughter. And then they were almost immediately released under a prearranged government amnesty. Justice for Matteotti was just entirely subverted. Yet, Matteotti's legacy could not be erased by a sham trial. In historical photographs from the era, you can actually see ordinary Italian citizens bravely placing a wreath right on the Lungotevere Arnaldo de Brescia, the exact spot where he was kidnapped. Despite the immense danger of openly defying Mussolini's new regime, Matteotti immediately became the ultimate enduring symbol of anti-fascist resistance, a symbol that would go on to inspire partisan fighters 2 decades later during the liberation of Italy. Which leaves us with a really provocative question to ponder today. Think about this. If the opposition had stayed in Parliament and fought Mussolini from the inside, rather than walking out and waiting for a king who was never going to act, could the slide into dictatorship have been stopped? It's a haunting lesson about the fragility of democratic institutions and how the moral outrage over a single horrific crime can paradoxically be manipulated to extinguish freedom entirely. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning history. Catch you next time.